All right, Shabbos, good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's share. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Teves, Habalin Tova Ushim and the Schreiber. We're dedicating Obishum and Drashos this month in the schus of Refuah Shlema for Eliyahu Rafael ben Miriam. Matin Chanalea Margalit, in memory of Mati's father, Yosef Shlomo Moshe Shmuel ben Yukasu Yehuda, whose yahrzeit is on Chav Dalet Teves. Our week of learning sponsors, Ari and Michali Friedman, in honor of the entire Kehila. Our day of learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in the schus of Refuah Shlema for Yaakov ben Etalea. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the Neshamas and Aliyah, the families in Nechama, all those in the Refuah, should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael and Kadosh Baruch Hu Shali Meretz Hashem, continue to shower Besaros Tovos upon Am Yisrael and Eretz Yisrael. But with that, let us begin another crazy day. A good crazy. Today's daf is Kuf Tesvav 115, but you would have no idea based on that where we're starting. Okay, we are starting on Kuf Yadalit Amud Beis 114b. Here's the good news. By the way, I looked ahead a little bit. Monday, which is the last daf of Zevachim, is a very short Amud Beis. I'm putting everything. I'm staking my entire career is on that. All right, so we're picking up Kuf Yadalit Amud Beis 114b, and we are picking up. Let's actually pick up 4 lines down from the top. I'm a little embarrassed to say it. Rabbi Amar, we got further. We got much. We got like 3 lines further than that, right? So again, remember, we're trying to figure out, we're focusing now on the Shita of Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah said that Halach L'Maisa is one of the interesting machloks between Rabbi Shimon and the Tana Kama. What happens if you offer up outside of the Beis HaMikdash something that is mechusar zman? Like for example, and I'm using that term very broadly. You offer up an animal that right now is not fit to be offered, but it will be fit. Now that could be a number of different categories. That could be an animal that has a mum right now, but the mum is going to heal, right? So right now it's not fit, but it will become fit. Or a carbon that is not yet aged in, but it will age in. What happens in all those cases? Tanakama holds, the Rabbana hold, you're pater. Because remember, again, they go based on the classic rule. What's the classic rule? If the parallel offering cannot be offered up inside the Beis HaMikdash, there is liability for doing it outside. Rabbi Shimon is of the opinion that no, it is an isser. It is asser. Now again, it's not kares like regular shchut echot is, but it will be a lav. So now the Gemara is just trying to figure out where does Rabbi Shimon get that from? So we've seen a couple of different opinions. We saw Rabbi Eli in the name of Reish Lakish, then we saw Rabbi Nachman, and now we're up to Rabbah. So Rabbah says as follows: Time to Rabbi Shimon Kidisanya. Rabbi Shimon's logic is as follows. Kidisanya. Both say Rabbi Cement is filming. Make sure you're on the right daf. Right daf. Also right Masechta. This is Zevachim again 114b. Make sure you're there. Thank you. Good. The Gemara says as follows: Rabbi Amar Tamid Rabbi Shimon Kidisanya. Rabbi Shimon says, "Minayim lezoveach Pesach bebamas yachid b'shas isra bam shvilo sase." Okay, so we'll say now. Listen to this case. Rabbi Shimon says like this. So this is Rabba's understanding over here of Rabbi Shimon. So Rabbi Shimon says like this: where do we know that if someone offers up a carbon Pesach bamas yachid, which is again an individual altar, at a time that bamos are aser? Give me an example. When are bamos aser? Good. Beis HaMikdash is easy one. When else? Shiloh. Good. When else? Desert, right? Pretty much is desert, Shiloh, Beis HaMikdash. Those are going to be the 3 times that bama is going to be aser. So you offer up a carbon Pesach on your private bama at a time that bamos are aser. So what's the halacha? Shubalo saseh, that it is a lav. That it's a lav. How do you know that? Talmud Lomar lo sucha lizbach es haPasach. Pasuk says you can't offer up the Pesach. So again, that phrase, you can't offer up the Pesach. So that in and of itself shows us that again, there are times that you can't offer up the Pesach. When can't you offer up the Pesach? At a time that bamos are aser, and you're doing it on your own bama. Yachol af b'shas heter bamas. Now, Cain, you would have thought that maybe, again, even when bamos are mutter, perhaps you also can't go ahead and offer up a carbon pesach on your bama. Talmud Lomar, be'echad sha'arecha. This is interesting. The Torah says in one of your gates. Now, we'll say, now one of your gates means like in your private home. Lo amarti lecha ela b'shah shekol Yisrael nichnasa mishar echad. When is there an isser to offer up a carbon pesach on a private bama at a time that all of Klal Yisrael is entering into one gate? They both say, what does that phrase represent? All of Klal Yisrael we're entering into one gate. What does that represent? Again, central place. Again, it could be Shiloh, it could be the Mishkan in the desert, it could be the Beis HaMikdash, one central place. So the Gemara says as follows. So good. We'll say, by the way, if you think about this, that is the beauty of the Beis HaMikdash. We speak of this all the time. What is the beauty of the Beis HaMikdash? What is it? It's that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is there. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is everywhere, right? What is it? Karbanos? I don't know. Offering up a karbanos may or may not do it for you. Ability to see the Kohanim? Absolutely. There's no question that is a plus. But the real essence of the Beis HaMikdash is called, it's a Sha'ah Shekol Yisrael Nichnasen B'Shar Echad. It's ultimately, and all of Klal Yisrael is going in through one gate. There's that unity, there's that achdus, there's that sense, almost like vision of singular purpose, of being a united people. That's what the Beis HaMikdash does for us more than anything. We all enter in through the same gate. It's so beautiful. So Gemara says, Amos. Now, when is this carbon being offered? Inema achar chatzos. If you're talking about after chatzos, so kares nami mechayiv. Then ultimately, again, there'll be a chiv kares. Elalav kodim chatzos. Rather, it must be talking about before chatzos. Everyone will say that would be again a case of mochos or zman. To which the Gemara says, no. The olam la'achar chatzos. We're talking about after chatzos. Ubishas heter abamos kar. We're talking about when bamos are mutter. So Rabbi says, so now, what do you do with Karban Pesach at a time that bamos are mutter? Vaha bishas isra bamos ka'amar. But it says over here that it's talking about a time of isra bamos. To which the Gemara says, Isra bamalo, heter bamala chabero. When bamos are mutter, there are certain things that are permitted on the bama, certain things that are not permitted on the bama. So I will say, interestingly enough, what the Gemara seems to be indicating over here is that halacha l'maisa, even when bamos are permitted, it is quite possible that halacha l'maisa, Karban Pesach can't be offered up on a bama. Now, what's interesting about Karban Pesach is, remember again, categorically, where does Karban Pesach fit into? Where does it fit into? Shlamim. Shlamim usually falls under the category of Nidarim and Nidavos, which are, again, discretional sacrifices, which can be offered up on a bama. Yet the Gemara seems to indicate over here that halacha l'maisa, even when bamos are mutter, you can't offer up Karban Pesach on a bama. And Abba said, listen to this, that is in fact the halacha in the Rambam. The Rambam says in Karban Pesach, halacha aleph, parak aleph, halacha gimel. Ein shochtin esa Pesach ela ba'azara kishar kachim. Karban Pesach can only be offered up, can only be slaughtered in the Beis HaMikdash, in the Kari Beis HaMikdash, like other karbanos, like other kachim. Af, get ready for this. Af, b'shas heter abamus, lo hayu makriven esa Pesach bebamas yachid. So I will say again, even when there was no Beis HaMikdash, right? Even when bamos were mutter, you cannot offer up your Karban Pesach on your personal bama. Why not? So the Gemara says, Shne'emar lo sucha lizboach es hapasach ba'achad sha'arecha. It's an explicit pasuk. You can't offer up the Karban Pesach in your private home. Now again, I will say, obviously, if it's talking about a time of Isser bamos, that's obvious. The Torah doesn't have to say that. When is the pasuk talking to? Even a time of heter bamas. Even a time of heter bamas, when bamas are mutter, you can't offer up the Karban Pesach ultimately again inside your private gates. So we'll say a ridiculously amazing halacha. Right? So therefore again, halacha l'maisa, you can't offer up a Karban Pesach in your private bama, even when private bamos are mutter. There's a tremendous musar haskell in this, which a tremendous vashkafa. What is Karban Pesach? Karban Pesach ultimately, again, is the Karban which concretized our identity as a people. That's what happened. It was the first communal offering. That Karban, which concretizes and solidifies our identity as a nation, cannot be offered up in your private house. It doesn't work. It doesn't shtim. Karban Pesach is all, again, I will say, think about this. How do you eat Karban Pesach? How do you eat it? How do you eat it? Right? It has to be a chabura. You can't eat a Karban Pesach alone. Why? Because the entire animal has to be finished, no matter how voracious your appetite is. No person is eating, unless like you're one of those like competitive eaters, right? But no one is eating an entire lamb. So by definition, you have to get other people as part of your chabura. That's the entire essence of Karban Pesach. creation of community, creation of the klal, a sense of achdus. Halacha l'maisa and hashkafa l'maisa, you can't offer up Karban Pesach. You can't offer it up in your own private bama, even if bamos are mutter. Not allowed to do it. Incredible. They both say fine. So everyone's agreeing on the sheet of Rabbi Shimon that if you offer up a karban that is what we'll call mechusar zman, whose time has not yet come, Rabbi Shimon says that it is prohibited by a lav. What's the source of Rabbi Shimon? A number of different approaches. Beautiful. Let's go back there. Mechusar zman. So the Gemara says both. So then remember again. Then the Mishnah gave a number of different examples of this, right? The Mishnah said, for example, talk about mechusar zman by the bailim, right? Mechusar zman ultimately again by people. So the Gemara says, for example, Zav, Zava, Yoledes, Mitzora, who offered up their chatas or their asham outside, right? Then they're pater, but their ola and shlamim, they would be chayiv. So the Gemara says, one second. The Gemara says, mechusar zman, v'hani b'nei asham, and these people bring asham. Doesn't bring an asham. The Gemara says, El Amr Ziri Tani Mitzora Ba'adai. Ziri said, you're right, add in Mitzora into the Mishnah. Add Mitzora in, because Mitzora does bring out asham. Okay, although saying V'shal Mehen, V'hani B'nei Shlamim, but 1 second, does this chaver bring olos and shlamim? Amr of Sheshes Tani Nazir. Add in Nazir to the group. Okay, so you just have to add in. The Mishnah didn't mean to make a specific list, but meant to make a general list. And in Achinami, you may have to, if you want to make it technically correct, just add in these individuals. The Ziri Kavua Tanoi, Ziri's interpretation was, or Ziri's comment was included by the Tanoim. Rav Sheshes's was not. Amr Chilkia, Lo Shanu Elo Lishmo. Okay, so now listen to this. When we speak about this idea that an asham that is mechusar zman, so for example, let's say any of these individuals had to bring an asham, but they brought it before the prescribed time. So again, Rabbi Shimon says you're chayiv on a lav. The Tanakama says you're pater. So when is that so? So the Gemara Rav Tuvi said lo shanu ela lishmo. That's only if the carbon is being brought lishmo. In other words, for the sake of an asham. Aval shalo lishmo chayiv. But if you brought it shalol lishmo, then ultimately again you're chayiv. Why? Hoil v'roi l'shalol lishmo bifnim. Remember again, this goes back literally again to Zevachim Beis Amud Aleph. That what is the halacha generally if you offer up a carbon shalol lishmo? What's the halacha? It works, but it just doesn't satisfy the obligation of the owners. So therefore, again, when do we say that halacha l'maisa again, that there is a lot that you're exempt from liability? Ultimately, again, if you offer it up for mechusar zman, that's only if you offered it up l'shmo. You offered up, let's say, a premature asham, the shame asham outside, because then the parallel carbon of offered up inside would not be valid. However, the Gemara says, "Aval shelo l'shmo chayiv, hol v'roi shelo l'shmo bifnim." This is very interesting, but if you offered up a premature asham, let's say for example, now asham might not be the best example because asham is like chatas, but again you get the idea. If you offer up a carbon shalol lishmo outside of the Beis Hamikdash, right, bachutz, ultimately again you would be liable. Why would you be liable? Because the parallel carbon can be offered up inside and be an acceptable carbon. Granted, it won't satisfy the obligation of the owner, but ultimately, again, will be accepted. If that's the case, lishmo nami lechayiv. If that's the case, even if it was offered up lishma, you should still go to be chayiv. Why? Halvaroi l'shalo lishmo bifnim. Because just say, even though you're offering it up lishmo b'chut, it should still be chayiv. Why? Because if you were to offer it up shalo lishmo inside, you would be liable. To which the Gemara says, no, by akira. Now, both say when we speak about the idea that a carbon offered up shalol lishmo is going to be chayiv, that's because there's an active uprooting of the identity, right? When you offer up a carbon shalol lishmo, you're actively offering it up for something else. That active uprooting of primary identity is what allows it to be an effective carbon, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive. So if one raises the kasha, is there any such thing as a carbon? That I understand. If you offered up l'shmo, it's not kosher, but shalol l'shmo, it is kosher, which sounds like is exactly what's happening over here. What about Pesach? Right, we'll say Karban Pesach is an excellent example. Right, the Gemara says Pesach b'shaymos hashana de'eno kasher l'shmo, the kasher shal l'shmo. They both say if you were to decide today, if there was a Beis Hamikdash today, how should be zocha, and you decide to offer up a Karban Pesach today, what's the halacha? It's not kosher, right? But if you offered up a Karban Pesach Shalol Lishmo today, what will be the halacha? It's kosher. Because what's the Karban Pesach Shalol Lishmo? What's the Karban? Shlamim. So it sounds crazy, but here's an example of a carbon being offered up lishmo, and it does not work. And shalol lishmo, it will work. The Shmuel says, no, that's not a good example. Pesach b'shayimos hashana shlamim minu. Pesach, by definition, is a carbon shlamim. By definition, it's carbon shlamim. During Pesach, or on the 14th of Nisan, it is called a Pesach. And the rest of the year, by definition, it is called a shlamim. So that's not a good example. So let's bring a support to this. I might have thought that ultimately, again, I would exclude from the liability of bachutz an olah that is mechusar zman, right? Mechusar zman b'baylim. Because remember again, what mechusar zman b'baylim means, the person has to bring an olah, but it's not yet the time to bring an olah. I might have thought ultimately, again, they would be exempted from liability, or asham nazir v'asham metzora, or same thing, the asham of a nazir, asham metzora that has to be brought, but it's not yet the right time to bring it. Talmud lomar shar mikol makom kesev mikol makom eis mikol makom. Therefore, the pasuk says again, shar kesev and eis, to include all karbanos. V'ilu chatos sharia. But interesting enough, if you notice, chatos is left off this list. So am I asking, now what are we dealing with over here? Ilima bismano. If it's talking about that the carbon is being offered up at the right time, my area asham, then why does it dafka just say asam? Afilu chatos nami. Chatos would also be in this same category. Elo shalol bismano or bismano. Rather, we must be talking about a carbon that is not being offered up in its appropriate time. And we say not its appropriate time, or prematurely. Ubemai. And what are we talking about? Ilema lishmo. If we're talking about the carbon is being offered up lishma, then Gemara says asham amai chayiv. Then ultimately, again, why would there be liability? Why would there be ultimately, again, liability for an asham shelo bismano that's being offered up lishma? Alalaf shelo lishmo. Rather, we must be talking about the carbon is being offered up not for its attention. I know this whole thing is a little bit reversed, right? Because remember, generally we've been conditioned to think that when you offer up a carbon shelo lishmo, what is that? That's a pagam, like that's a deficiency in the carbon. Now remember, we're talking about liability for shechting the carbon bachutz. So remember, in order to be liable for bachutz, what do you need? What do you need? The parallel case has to generate liability if done inside. The problem is if you're talking about a premature asham, when I say premature asham, means the owner is not yet ready to bring it. It's not yet his time. So if he does it lishmo, that carbon is not a valid, it would not be valid if done inside. If it's not valid done inside, then it's not valid if done outside. However, if it's an asham shalol lishmo. So again, remember, a carbon shalol lishmo is an effective carbon. Doesn't satisfy the obligation of the owner. If that's the case, interestingly enough, a shalol lishmo carbon done bachutz, even if it's not at the right time, may actually generate liability because the parallel carbon, if done inside shalol lishmo, would be an acceptable carbon. Fascinating. So the Gemara says, the olam bismano v'shalol l'shmo. Really, we're talking about a carbon that is being brought at the right time, but ultimately, again, shalol l'shmo. Rabbi Eliezer and ultimately, again, this reflects the view of Rabbi Eliezer. Da'amar makshinon asham l'chatos. We compare an asham to a chatos, which is a comparison that we've seen many times before. Vitana tafavu adin ikar. And ultimately, again, once we mention a chatos, or I should say, once we mention an asham, ultimately, again, it certainly includes a chatos as well. Incredible. Tashma, v'yachol shani marbe olas muchos rizman begufa v'chatos bein begufa bein bebailim. You would have thought that perhaps I would include in the exclusion an olah, this is about where there's no liability for shvutei chutz. An olah that is muchosr zman begufa, which means the animal itself is not yet ready to be offered, or a chatos that is premature, whether again is premature because it itself is not aged in, or the owners are deficient, or it's not yet the time of the owners. Talmud lomar v'al pesach oel moed kol she'en aroi lava pesach oel moed ein chayav l'leil. Keep quoting this pasuk, right? In order for there to be liability for bachutz, the carbon has to be able to be brought into the Beis HaMikdash. Therefore, again, if it's not able to be brought into the Beis HaMikdash, ultimately, again, you are not chayiv for it. V'ilu asham shaira. And yet, interestingly enough, asham is left off the list. So I'm asking, what are we talking about? Ilema l'shmo. If we're talking about that as being done l'shmo, asham nami liftere. Then ultimately, again, there also shouldn't be liability for an asham, because again, if it's an asham, ultimately again bismano or shalo bismano lishmo, then it's not going to be effective. Elalav shalo lishmo. Rather, he wants to think about carbon is not being brought lishmo. The olam shalo lishmo. To which the Gemara says, "You're right. Reality, we're talking about a case of shalo lishmo." We'll say, "Don't worry, we're going to get to the conclusion shortly." Rabbi Lazar, sorry, it's just. I know. I'm holding your attention intently over here, right? So again, just hold on. I got you. We're going to see that I'm in just a little bit. And by the way, ridiculous. I got it on base and base. Just hold on. Rabbi Lazar, who did makish asham lechatas. And Rabbi Lazar ultimately again is the one who compares asham to a chatas, to which the Gemara says once again, Tana Iker the chosh kein taf. On this version, again the Mishnah discusses the primary case and brings along the secondary case. Okay, Tashma Dichi Asar Avdimi Amar Tan de Rabbi Levi Yachol Shani Motzi Af Olas Mechosers Man Bebaidlim Asham Nazir Asham Mitzor Minayin. Supposed to listen to this. Rabbi Levi says like this. You might have thought that I would exclude, right, an olah that is mechusr zman bebailim, which means the owners. It's not yet the right time for the owners to bring their olah. What about an asham nazir and an asham mitzora? From where do I know that? The nasiv, we'll say for end of the first wide line. The nasiv lehu talmud lechiyuva v'lo yedana maichi. So ultimately, again, then the Gemara ultimately generates a chiyuv, but I'm not sure what the chiyuv is. My talmuda, what's the limud? Amravina shar mikol makom kesev mikol makom eiz mikol makom. The Torah, when discussing again the liability for shchutei chutz, gives these general statements of shar, kesef, and eiz, which indicates to us that any animals that are included in these carbonic categories ultimately will generate liability. So the Gemara says, "Hi, my rumya." So I don't understand what's the stira, what's the contradiction over here. Kidika amrit. Amrav Nachman mishum derami detani debei livoi adetani levi asham nazir va'asham mesora sheshachtan shalol lishman. If you have the asham of a nazir, asham and mesora, that were shechted shalol lishman ksherin. Ultimately, again, they are kosher. But it's a general case. So we'll say we've seen that halacha many times. You have an asham nazir and an asham tar and an asham mesora that were shechted shalol lishman, not for the purposes of the owner, not for the purpose of designated carbon. What's the halacha? The carbon itself is effective, but it does not count towards the obligation of the owner. Shachtan mechusr zman bebailim. So we'll say, but if halacha l'mais again it was shechted, and it's mechusr zman bebailim, which means it's not yet the right time for the owner to bring the carbon. Oh, shahayu b'nei shtei shanim v'shachtan, or they aged out ultimately again, and you shechted it. Psulin. It's not a contradiction. Kan l'shmo, kan shalo l'shmo. One is talking about a case where the carbon is shechted l'shmo, one is shalo l'shmo. I says Gemara Ravashi Rami Masnis and Abraiso Mishani. Ravashi contrasted the Mishnah with the Bryce, and he answers it as follows: Kan l'shmo, the kan shalo l'shmo. One case is sometimes the carbon was done l'shmo, one was shalo l'shmo. I lema to have it to the Rav Huna. So should this not refute Rav Huna? What's the case here? We'll say, what's the case over here? The case is where a person, mitchila, from the beginning, separated out two asham offerings. Now, why would you separate out two asham offerings to satisfy one liability? For achrayas, insurance, carbonic insurance, just in case something happens to the designated animal, you immediately have your replacement right there. The Gemara says, now, dechad minayu meikara ola. Now, we actually saw this in yesterday's daf, alluded to in yesterday's daf, or the day before as well, which is, whenever you have these cases where you are setting up a replacement carbon, by definition, the replacement is already categorically placed in a different, or is placed automatically in a different category. Since halacha l'maaseh is clear, you're not offering up two carbonos, right? You're only offering up one carbon. Therefore, by definition, in this case, the second asham, whichever one that turns out to be, is going to automatically be an ola. So the Gemara says, Amud Beis, Kid Rav Huna, just like Rav Huna said, the Gemara says, Kid Rav Huna Amarav, the Rav Huna Amarav, asham shinitak l'raya. If you have an asham that was set out to pasture, v'shachto stam, and you just end up shechting it. Again, I will say, an asham set out to pasture being exactly a case like we're talking about over here. I have to bring an asham. I designated 2 animals for achrayas. So obviously, I'm only offering one. The other one, what's going to happen? Now I say, offer up my asham. I set out the other one to pasture, and let's say you end up shechting that animal stam without a specific carbonic intent. What's the halacha? Kosher li'ola. Ultimately, again, it is kosher, because by default, it automatically becomes an ola. So let me just share with you some interesting halacha l'maisa over here, right? So what we have over here is as follows. So so in these cases over here, let me read to you, this is the Rambam in Hilchos Maseh Karbanos, Perek Yud Ches Halacha Yud. Asham taloi, v'chatas of abal asapek, shekrivim b'chutz, Potter, Shaylo Nikba Isra. Okay, we're going to leave it. Now listen to this. If you have an asham, you'll see why the Rambam is illustrating this with asham mitzora, but it'll make a lot of sense from everything else. Asham mitzora, which is the asham offering of a mitzora, sheshachta b'chutz, that was shechted outside of the Beis Hamikdash, shalo lishmo, right? Not for its intended purpose, right? Chayiv, hoil, v'shalo lishmo roi bifnim, v'kasha kamoshi yisbayer. The whole carbon shu pater al shchitasa b'chutz kachu pater alas. So both say what the Rambam teaches us is that this halacha is actually true, which is, or that this statement is actually halacha l'maisa, which is, in this case, remember again, we spoke about this idea. We have a machlokes, Rabbi Shmuel and the Rabbanon, which we still don't have resolution on, which is you go ahead and you offer up a carbon outside of the base of English that is mechusar zman. There are 2 ways for a carbon to become mechusar zman. What are the 2 ways? Either actually the carbon itself is too young, it hasn't aged, or, for example, it's an animal with a mum that will heal but hasn't healed yet. That's one mechusar zman. Or mechusar zman bebailim, which is the carbon is totally fine. The owner, it's not yet the right time for the owner to bring that carbon. And then he does it, he offers up the carbon with mechusar zman outside. Tanakama says, you're pater. Right, your pater. Why? Because again, if you were to offer up the same carbon inside, ultimately there would be no liability. Therefore, there could be no liability for bachutz. Rabbi Shimon says you are in violation of a lav, of a prohibition. Okay, so that's our machlokes. The Gemara then uses that as a springboard to say like this. Well, what happens if halacha l'maisa, you offer up a carbon that is mechusar zman but shelo lishmo? Shalol l'shmo. Now, I will say, so now remember again, in general, when you offer up a carbon shalol l'shmo, now this is not true by every carbon. For example, by a chatas, it doesn't apply. But in general, when you offer up a carbon shalol l'shmo, what's the halacha? The carbon works, but ultimately, again, it doesn't satisfy the obligation of the owner. So now watch this. So now in our cases over here, what I'm doing is, I'm offering up a carbon that might be mechusar zman, but I'm offering it up Shalol l'shmo. So and I'm shechting this bachutz. So what's the shayla? Am I liable or not? Now again, I'll say to which the Rambam says the halacha is ultimately again the halacha is Hashem Shalol l'shmo chayiv. The Rambam says you would be chayiv. Why? Again, the truth is it's not a chiddush. Why would you be chayiv? Because if the parallel carbon were to be offered inside the Beis Hamikdash, the carbon would be effective. Again, granted, would not satisfy the obligation of the owner, but absolutely would be effective. So that's how he passes. So a carbon, even if it's mechusar zman, but if it's offered up shalol l'shmo b'chutz, again, it would generate liability for shchutei chutz. Incredible. That's the sugya. Good. Hamayla mivasar chatas. Well, now remember again, the last case in the Mishnah. Well, not the last case, but as we kind of make our way towards the end of the Mishnah then went, if you remember again, went through a whole list of things, where if you offer them up outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you are not liable. You are not liable. So here I'll say, here's the list. Here we go. Tana Abanan. Minayin. We'll say, Aman Kufta Somes 115b. 4 lines down from the top. Here we go. Tana Banan. Minayin l'mayla mibasar chatos mibasar asham. So I'll say, how do I know that if I offer up the following things outside of the Beis Hamikdash? I'll say, here's the list. Number 1, chatos meat. And I'll say chatos meat. Not sacrificial parts, chatos meat, which is normally consumed by the Kohanim. So I offer up chatos meat, or, right, basar chatos, basar asham meat. Basar Kachei Kadashim, general sacrificial meat. Again, I will say, not to be confused with sacrificial parts. Sacrificial parts, what we call a murin, right, are burnt on the mizbeach. Sacrificial meat is normally, with the exception of an olah, consumed by the kohanim or owners, depending on the carbon. So basar Kachei Kadashim, the meat of Kachei Kadashim. Mi basar Kachim Kalim, the meat of Kachim Kalim. Mi moser ha'omer, the leftover of the carbon omer, shtei lechem, the 2 loaves of Shavuos, lechem apanim, right, that's the bread that's put on the shulchan, shiore minchas, or the leftover of mincha. Now, what's common denominator amongst all these items? Common denominator amongst all these items, they are all consumed. They're not burnt on the mizbeach, they're all consumed. So how do I know that if I took any of these items outside of the Beis HaMikdash and I burnt it outside of the Beis HaMikdash, shepater, that I am pater? How do I know that? Talmud Lomar, Ola. Therefore, again, the pasuk says Ola. Now, again, just to understand, what's the pasuk we're referring to? V'aleim tomer ish mi beis Yisrael umin ager asher yagu b'socham asher ya'ala Ola o zavach v'al pesach o amoy lagia. So again, shchutei chutz, offering up. So how does the Torah frame the liability for offering up a carbon outside? It says if you offer up an Ola. What's unique about an Ola? Ma'ola shiruya lahala, afkol shiruya lahala. Joe says, so what's unique about an Ola? An Ola belongs in the Mizbeach. So when is there liability for offering up a carbon outside of the Beis HaMikdash? Only when you're offering up something which belongs on the Mizbeach. But if it doesn't belong on the Mizbeach, ultimately, again, there is no liability. Incredible. So you take any of these items which are normally eaten and you offer it up on the Mizbeach, no liability. Listen to this. Minayim, shaf hayotzek v'habolel. How do I know Abosai that yotzek? Now these are all processes by carbon mincha. How do I know yotzek means to pour the oil? Bolel means to mix it all together. Poses means certain types of menachos, right? Were broken up. The pieces were broken up. V'hamoleach, or if you salt the carbon. V'hamenev, or if you wave a carbon. V'hamagish, or you bring it near to the mizbeach. V'hamesader hashulchan, or you arrange the lechem hapanim on the table. V'hametiv esaneros, or you arrange the wicks in the menorah. V'hakometz, or you take a kometz. V'hamekabel, or you do kabbalah. You receive the blood in the kli, bachutz, outside of the Beis HaMikdash, shepater. So I'll say, how do I know that all of these things, if I do them outside of the Beis HaMikdash, I'm pater? How do I know that? Talmud Lomar, asher ya'ala ola o zavach. If you will offer up an ola or a carbon, maha'ala shigmar avoda, just like putting the animal on the mizbeach is the concluding rite of the carbon. At kol shu gemar avoda. So to anything that is a concluding rite. So both say there are 2 very important lessons over here that are learned. When is there liability for shchutei chutz? You need 2 things. Number 1, it has to be something that is normally put on the mizbeach, right? If you do something, it's not normally, for example, if you take sacrificial meat that's eaten, that's normally consumed by the kohanim, by the owner, and you burn that on an altar outside of the Beis HaMikdash, not good, but lemaisa, again, not in violation of shchutei chutz. That's halacha number 1. And number 2, interestingly enough, you are only liable when that which you do outside is a concluding or finalizing ritual or rite. If you do something that is just a stage or a process in the sacrificial service, you are not chayiv. Fascinating. Okay, now I'll say now, all right, get ready for this. Now, we are going to sink our teeth into what I think was probably the most exciting part of the Mishnah, and may actually be, in many respects, one of the most exciting things we've seen in Maseches Zevachim, which is that last part of the Mishnah that went through the various stages of the Mishkan, and again, what was permitted and what was prohibited at those various stages. So watch this. Says we have some really incredible Gemara ahead of us. Achal Hukam Mishkan. Okay, so Yosef Rav Huna, Barav Katina, Kamed Rav Chista, Vika Kari, because it's fascinating. So what happened? So Rav Huna Barav Katina was sitting in front of Rav Chista, and he was reading the following pasuk. What does the pasuk say? Vayishlach es na'arei b'nei Yisrael. So we'll say the pasuk in its entirety. This is by Har Sinai. Vayishlach es na'arei b'nei Yisrael, vayalu olos, vayizbuchu zvachim shlomim la'Hashem parim. So Moshe Rabbeinu dispatched the Na'arei Yisrael, and they offered up karbanos at the base of the mountain. Now watch this. Watch this. So we'll say, first of all, take a look at Rashi over here for just a moment. Actually, no, not yet. Fine. So the Gemara says as follows. So Amalei, Haki Am Ravasi. So ultimately, and it says, this is what Ravasi said, Karvu Paskin. I will say, here's what's interesting. Who's offering up Karbanos in this pasuk? Who's offering it up here? Narim. You lads. So we'll say, we're understanding this over here to mean it wasn't Kohanim. Rather, who was it? Bechoros. It was firstborns. So we'll say, so now this yields a fascinating, riveting, overwhelmingly troubling question, which is, here's what I know. Firstborns offered up Karbanos by Har Sinai. The next piece of information I know is that by Yom HaShmini, right? By Yom HaShmini, ultimately, again, a number of months later, Kohanim start offering up in the Mishkan. Right? That's what I know. What's the Shaila? What was happening in the interim? Or to state it a little bit differently, at what point in time did Avoda stop with the firstborn and officially transfer over to the Kohanim? It's fascinating. I will say, think about this. We never even think about these questions, right? Because we just kind of read the Chumash and we kind of go event to event. But there is, right? Remember that the Torah is given in Sivan. The Mishkan was not done until the following Nisan. So there's a good number of months in between Sinaitic revelation and ultimately Akamas HaMishkan. So who's doing the avoda during that time? So the Gemara says, Amar Ravasi, Karvu Upasku. Really what happened over here is as follows. The Bechorim did the avoda that day by Har Sinai, and that was it. That was the last time. The last Karbanos offered up by the firstborns, by the Bechorim, ultimately again was at Har Sinai. From that point forward, it was done by Kohanim. Look at Rashi just a moment. Amar le Rav Huna, Hachi Amar Ravasi Upasku, O Sayom Paska Avoda Min HaBechoros. That day by Har Sinai, that was the last day that the firstborns did the avoda. Shemesina nitztavu ala kahuna kedirav lekamon v'shimshu nadav aviu kol os hashana rishona atraka mishkan mesu. So what it says, we're going to see, according to this opinion of Ravasi, that day at Har Sinai, pretty much, they were commanded that from this point forward, avoda is to be done by the Kohanim. So after that day, now again I will say, there's not a plethora of Kohanim. Who is there? There's Aaron, Nadav, and Avihu, right? So Allah's already Tamar come later on, right? So ultimately again, by Har Sinai, firstborns did the avoda. After that moment, Nadav and Avihu, Aaron take over. Incredible. So Gemara says, Savarli Osim Masnisin. So ultimately, Rav Chisda wanted to contradict this statement, ultimately again from a Mishnah. But then he heard also Rav Asi say, then he heard him say the name of Rav Bar Ava, Ola Shekrivu Yisrael Bamidbar, Eina Tu'una Hefshet V'nituach. That the Ola offered up by Klal Yisrael in the Midbar did not require Hefshet. Hefshet means flaying or skinning, V'nituach, and cutting up into parts. So the Gemara says, Osvei Braisa, this Shavya Bekulu. Rav Chisda was going to go ahead and slug him up and contradict him from both statements from a Braisa. So we'll say, so again, just to understand what happened over here. There are two statements that were made. Statement number one, right, Rav Huna bar Rav Katina ultimately said two things. Number one, he said that avoda, the last time that the firstborn, the Bechoros, did the avoda was by Har Sinai. After Har Sinai and on, it was done by Kohanim. That was statement number one. Statement number two is that when they offered up an Ola in the desert, remember again, an Ola, what happens to an Ola? Totally burns. In the desert, it did not require flaying or quartering or cutting up into pieces. Rav Chisda felt that both of those statements were incorrect, and therefore wanted to go ahead and refute them both from a brisa. Here we go. The Gemara says, "Desanya achlo hokam mishkan habamos mutaros va'avoda bebechoros va'kol ksher lahakriv behema chay va'of zichar munekevas tmimin ubali mumin tahorna va'lo tmein." So let's listen to this. So what did we learn? Up until the point that the Mishnah is a Mishnah. Up until the point that the Mishkan was, before the Mishkan was erected, what's the halacha? Bamos remutter. It was in the desert. Bamos remutter. The avoda was done by the firstborn, and everything and everyone is kosher. right? Everyone and everything is permitted to offer and be offered. Behema, chaya, oaf, male, female, tmimin, balimumin, right? Unblemished, blemished, tahorin, rather yatar, not right? The Gemara says avalot, right? Tahorin, avalot min, right? So the one prerequisite was you had to be tar, you couldn't be tameh. Let's say first white line, vakol karvu olos, and remember all karbanos offered up on bamos were olos. Right, olos, only olos offered up on bamos. The Gemara says, "Olos shekrivi yisoma midbar tuna hefshit vinituach," and olos that were offered up in the desert ultimately again require flaying and quartering. V'nochrim bazman hazeh rasha'in la'asos kain. And by the way, nochrim, non-Jews, even in this time, can still use bamos. Brand new piece of information, right? Even Nachrim could go ahead and use bamos today, and all of the regular halachos of bamos apply to them. They will say, so what do you see from here? So there's a couple of things you see from here. Number one, what do you see? Is that number one, an ola, even in the desert, does require flaying and quartering. But number two, what else do you see? That avoda up until the Mishkan was put up and bamos were mutter, avoda can be done by anyone, including Bechoros. This contradicts Rav Asi, because Rav Asi says right after at Har Sinai, that was the handoff. It went Bechorim offered a Bechoros, offered up this carbon over here, and then it was handed off afterwards to the Kohanim. So now we have a contradiction, right? We have a tremendous machlokes. At what point in time did the Kohanim take over? According to Rav Asi, ultimately, again, they took over Mamish at Har Sinai. Again, the Na'arim, who were the firstborn, did their Karban at Har Sinai. That was their last offering. After that, Kohanim, according to Rav Chisda, according to this Mishnah, no, Kohanim took over already at Har Sinai itself, after that Karban. Incredible. Incredible. To which the Gemara will say, second wide line, 115b, Tanahi. It's a machlokes Tanaim. Say machlokes Tanoim, Tisanya, V'gama Kohanim Anigashim Hashem Iskadashu. Suppose listen to this. The pasuk says, and that is very interesting. The pasuk says, also the Kohanim who come close to Hashem Yiskadashu. Now we'll say again. Now what does Yiskadashu mean in this context? Yiskadashu, Rashi says, Milalos. V'afal Pishar Gilin Lageshes Elai Ulahalos Ha'idban Shal Yalu Bahar. Now Yiskadashu means they shall sanctify themselves by withdrawing. So Hashem is saying, even the Kohanim, who normally are granted a heightened degree of access to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, by Har Sinai, when the Shekhinah came down, they must maintain their distance. Gama Kohanim anigash Hashem Yiskadashu. Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha Omer, Zu Prishas Bechoros. So Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha says, ultimately, again, this pasuk of Gama Kohanim, Kohanim over here doesn't mean Kohanim. What does it mean? What does it mean? Firstborns. Because the firstborns, the Bechoros, were actually operating as the Kohanim at this point in time. And the Torah is telling us, even the Bechoros, even firstborns, who are operating in a priestly fashion, must maintain their distance from the mountain. Must maintain their distance from the mountain. Zu Prishas Bechoros. Rebbe says, Zu Prishos Nadav and Avihu. Rebbe says, no, that's not what it means. Kohanim means Kohanim. Kohanim means Kohanim, not firstborns. Rather, what does it mean? Nadav and Avihu. So we'll say, so I see what's happening over here? This is Machlokes Tanoim. Who operated in the capacity of Kohanim at Har Sinai? And by the way, that frames who operated out. Again, remember, it seems to be that everyone is agreeing that when Moshe Rabbeinu dispatches the Na'arim to do the Karbanos at the base of the mountain, that is referring to firstborns. The shaila is after that, what happened? So it sounds like over here, Rabbi Shmuel ben Karcha is saying, still even then, it's the firstborns who are doing the avodah. When does the handing over of the baton occur? By Yom HaShmini. On the 8th day of the consecration of the Mishkan, that's when the baton is handed over to the Kohanim, but up until that point, it's all Bechorim. Rebbe seems to say, no, the Bechoros did the avodah at the base of Mount Sinai, of Har Sinai. After that, they're done. They're done. From that point forward, everything is done by the Kohanim. And the nafkamina over here is when the pasuk says, Kohanim, don't come close to the mountain. Who are they talking to? Is it talking to the firstborns, or is it talking to Nadav and Avihu? Incredible. So Bishlam and Precious Nadav Avihu, I knew Dichsev, Hu Asher Diba Hashem Neimar Bikrovai Akadesh. Okay, so we'll say this is about to get overwhelming. So watch this. So now, according to Rebbe, who says that the Kohanim that are referenced to at Har Sinai refers to actual Kohanim, then what happens in Parsha Shmini, remember again, I'll say fast forward a little bit. The day that the Mishkan was consecrated on the 8th day, what happens? Nadav and Avihu die. Whatever exactly it is that they did, the Torah says, Bakrivam Eish Zara. They brought forth an alien fire. They did something they weren't supposed to do, they died. Remember again, after their death, Moshe turns to Aaron and he says, Hu Asher Dibar Hashem. Their death is a fulfillment of that which God said. What did God say? Bikrovai Akadesh. I will be sanctified through my holy ones. Nadav and Avihu are the holy ones. When did God say, I'll be sanctified through my holy ones? So I'll say, if you go back to Har Sinai, and it says, V'gam hakohanim hanigashim al Hashem yiskadashu. The Kohanim who come close to Hashem, they will be sanctified. Now again, granted, by Har Sinai, sanctification, Kedusha, ultimately means what? Removal from the mountain. Which Shabbos said, by the way, is a tremendous Moshe Haskell that Yiskadashu literally means to go ahead and separate yourself from the mountain. Shabbos say, this resonates with incredible importance. What is the core definition of Kedusha? Right, when the Torah says Kedoshim Tiyu. So again, what does the Ramban and others say? What does Kedoshim Tiyu mean? Kadesh es atzmicha b'ma shemutalach. Kedusha means abstinence even in the realm of that which is permitted. It means knowing, it means creating for yourself certain lines, creating for yourself certain gidarim, certain red lines, certain protective fences, even in the realm of that which is permitted. Like the Ramban's famous example will say, am I allowed to eat meat and drink wine for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Can I do that? Yeah. Is it a good idea? I'm not asking about my cholesterol, right? Is it a good idea? No. Why? Because that creates a gluttonous lifestyle. But it's mutter, sure. There are a lot of things that are mutter, but just because it's mutter doesn't mean that it's good for you. Just because it's permitted doesn't mean that it's good. Just because it's, so in other words, you could go ahead and live within the confines of the law and totally do things which undermine your personalistic growth. The key step to Kedoshim Tiyu is identifying what lines do I need to draw for myself in the realm of that which is permitted in order to go ahead and become a holy individual. And I will say, it's incredible, by the way. I always wondered, where does the Ramban get that from? But it's not just the Ramban. Where do they get this idea that Kedoshim Tiyu means sanctify yourself from that which is permitted? In other words, draw your lines even though important. And interesting enough, I think it comes right from here. Because what does the Torah say? Also the Kohanim who come close to me, Yiskadashu. And Yiskadashu means don't come close on the mountain. So you see from here that Kedusha means to distance yourself from certain things. There are certain things which may be permitted, but they're not good for me. It's not going to get me where I need to get to in life. And it's from here. So therefore, again, if you understand that the Kohanim being referenced at Har Sinai are Nadav and Avihu, then when Nadav and Avihu die, and Moshe Rabbeinu says, oh, this is what Hashem meant when he said, Bikrovai Akadesh. I will be sanctified through my Kedoshim. Because again, at Har Sinai, Hashem says to Nadav and Avihu, Gam akohanim anigoshim al Hashem yiskadoshu. Granted, yiskadoshu bar Sinai means distance themselves, but it's the same word of Kedusha. Said Moshe Rabbeinu's statement to Aaron makes a lot of sense. Elaman de Amar, zu precious bechoros heicher amiza. But Rabbi said ultimately again, but if you understand that the pasuk of Gama Kohanim anigoshim al Hashem yiskadoshu, when Hashem tells the Kohanim by Har Sinai, don't come close, that it's not talking about Kohanim. Rather, who is it talking about? It's talking about Bechoros. So again, where do we find the death of Nadav and Avihu alluded to? Because the pasuk says, "V'no'arati shama l'bnei Yisrael v'nikdash bichvodai." So as the pasuk says, I will go ahead and I will make myself known to Klal Yisrael. I was talking about the Mishkan. "V'no'arati shama l'bnei Yisrael." I will make myself known to Klal Yisrael. V'nikdash bichvodi. So literally translated, bichvodi means I will become sanctified ultimately through my honor. Al tikri bichvodi, don't read it as my honor. Ella b'mechubdai. With those, I will become honored through those who honor me. Those meaning Chash Baruch who says that my name will be sanctified ultimately, again, through the death of great people. We'll discuss what that means in just a moment. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Moshe. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said this to Moshe, V'lo yadu ad shemesu b'nei Aaron. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, this is such a riveting Gemara. So Hashem said this to Moshe. Hashem said this cryptic statement to Moshe, which is that what? That I will become great, right? I, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, will be made great through ultimately, again, the sanctification of my righteous ones. Now, just a word about what this means. In general, when we see strict justice visited upon the righteous, so this is a tremendous wake-up call for us, right? Why? Because I would assume, like generally what we would assume is the more righteous you are, kind of like the more latitude you get. Right? You're one of God's boys, you get like a little bit of latitude, a little bit of a pass. When we see that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is exacting with the righteous, it's a tremendous wake-up call to us. Because if that's what happens with the righteous, then alachas kama v'kama, how careful we have to be with our actions and we have to be with our behavior. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, this is incredible. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, I'm just telling you, there's going to come a time, v'no'arati shama libnei Yisrael, v'nikdash b'mechubdai. There will become a time where I will be sanctified through those who are closest and holiest to me. Hashem said this to Moshe, and Moshe had no idea what he was talking about. Which I will say, when does it all click for Moshe Rabbeinu? After the death of Nadav and Avihu. Because I will say, what happened with the death of Nadav and Avihu? Nadav and Avihu did something inside the Beis HaMikdash that they were not supposed to do. Now, whatever, there's a big machlokes exactly what their chait was. But what's the point? The point is, when you come Lifnei Hashem, when you come before the Ribbon Shalom, the closer you come, the more exacting God is. The closer you want to become, the more precise you have to be in your spiritual behavior. And if that's true with Kohanim, and if it's true with Nadav and Avihu who were tzaddikim, then al-achas kama v'kama, how true it is for us. If the righteous, right, if there's exacting and demanding requirements of the righteous, then all the more so there's exacting and demanding requirements of us as well. So again, Moshe Rabbeinu had no idea what God was talking about until the death of Nadav and Avihu, which Rabbi say is such a tremendous Moshe Haskell, which is sometimes things happen in life, and I have absolutely no idea what the meaning of these events are. But the whole yesod of life is, hold on, sit tight. One thing is clear. Somehow, some way, at some point, the pieces drop, and you begin to understand that you are part of a much bigger plan. Hashem says this thing to Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu has no idea what he's talking about. Tragic event occurs, and then Moshe Rabbeinu, it all dropped. It all fit into place. I'm going to leave you on a cliffhanger, because what happens next is the conversation between Moshe and Aaron, which is one of the most moving, riveting, and profound conversations in Kol HaTorah Kula. Rabosai, we're going to start tomorrow at 5:50. I would strongly urge you, be ready by 5:48, because it's gonna get intense, fast, right at the beginning of Shir tomorrow. To be continued, Rabosai. Shkoyach. All right, have a great day, everyone.